we need to step back. We need the different sectors within government, human health, animal health, plant health, environmental health. We have to work together and we have to look for options at trying to reduce risk of pathogen emergence and spread, but also do it in a way that's going to make our food systems more resilient, safer, and more efficient.
Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast for the foreign policy and global development communities and anyone who wants a deeper understanding of what is driving events in the world today. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg. I am a veteran international affairs journalist and the editor of UN Dispatch. Enjoy the show. H5N1, otherwise known as avian or bird flu, has been around for a long time. Mostly, the virus has passed among wild birds, but there have been several sporadic outbreaks in poultry flocks. Now, the virus has spread to dairy cattle here in the United States, and in at least 2 cases, from cattle to people. This has experts in pandemic prevention on high alert. Dairy workers come in close contact with cattle, and there is concern that the virus can mutate such that it not only passes from animals to people, but from human to human. On the line to discuss with me the risk that H5N1 makes that leap and what can be done to prevent it is Robyn Alders. She is an honorary professor with the Development Policy Center at the Australian National University and a member of the Lancet Commission on the Prevention of Viral Spillover. We kick off discussing the history of H5N1 before discussing this current outbreak among dairy herds. She gives an interesting explanation of why getting to the root cause of these outbreaks requires a fundamental shift in how we approach food systems. I learned a lot from this conversation. I know you will as well. Global health issues and pandemic prevention are the core of what this podcast does, even long before COVID-19. So I suspect we will be returning to this topic in the coming months. Now, here is my conversation with Robyn Alders. Robyn, thank you so much for chatting with me. Before we discuss this current situation, can you just give us a very brief history on avian influenza?
Thanks, Mark. Well, avian influenza, in terms of scientific virology, is a virus that we've known well. But up until the 1990s, we didn't see outbreaks in flocks of commercial chickens regularly. There would occasionally be a spillover from waterfowl that are known to carry avian influenza virus. Often the spillover would be via water sources that would go into the poultry installations. There'd be a diagnosis, and then the animal health authorities would work with the owners to quickly control the disease, stamp it out, and that would be the end of that outbreak. And I should say that was the case. When I studied veterinary science, I'm now getting a little long in the tooth, in the 1980s, avian influenza, as I say, was a rare disease. However, around the 1990s, we started getting protracted outbreaks of avian influenza in flocks, particularly in layer flocks and certainly in parts of Europe where they were having trouble really controlling it. And that was partly because of the density of birds, lots of birds in the one location and lots of movement of people between those flocks. So people started talking about vaccination of birds rather than the process of controlling and removing those birds. And what happened from the 1990s, when there were about 10 billion commercial chickens until now, is that we have 26 billion commercial chickens. So that's more than a doubling of the population. And they're all coming out of a very small lineage. So we have birds that are genetically very similar. raised in large numbers, high density, and really from the virus's perspective, this is pretty ideal. Once you've found one bird that's susceptible because they're so similar genetically, many of them are susceptible. So we talk about avian influenza, but really we've made the life of the virus a little easy by increasing the numbers of susceptible species and having rapid movement, not only of birds and egg trays, but also of people. And while influenza is a virus that we know causes pandemic, and the influenza A virus, under which avian influenza falls, is the type of virus that has caused all human pandemics to date.
What do we know about this current outbreak? We've had these sporadic outbreaks here in the United States for the last couple of years. I take it elsewhere in the world, we've had similar outbreaks?
Yes. In fact, people talk about worrying about human pandemic, but if you're a chicken, avian influenza, and particularly the H5N1 subtype, has been causing you a problem for many years. So since the widespread outbreaks in the early 2000s, there have been smouldering and ongoing outbreaks of H5N1 across much of the world, and particularly in areas where we do have high numbers of commercial poultry. So for chickens, it's been an ongoing problem. And one of the challenges is that as we've had this virus amplified, the influenza virus is an RNA virus, and its characteristic is it has a very short reproduction cycle, and it doesn't copy itself precisely. So every time you get a new virus, there's a chance that it's going to be slightly different. So the more virus we have, the more replication of that virus, the greater the chance of having slight changes or occasionally reassortment of virus so that we're getting new lineages developing. The good news is with molecular biology and the forensic epidemiology that's being done is that people can track that. But we are seeing not only that problem in the commercial poultry industry, but that spillback. And we're having these evolved viruses spilling back into wild birds, into migratory birds, but also into new lines of mammals. So in North America, you've had smouldering outbreaks of avian influenza in some of your commercial poultry units, and now being detected in these large dairy herds, very intensive, lots of cattle being raised in a small unit, and with at least one confirmed case of conjunctivitis in humans.
So it is like the unique characteristics of this virus that enabled it to mutate, change in some form, that now it is infecting dairy herds here in the United States. And there's been at least 2 cases now of humans getting infected from the dairy cattle. What's the epidemiological significance of the fact that this virus is now spread to cattle?
There's a number of significant points in that question. The first is that this is not the first time that we've had influenza in cattle. There are past reports of having an influenza type D in cattle, but it was a limited spread and appeared to die out. The importance with this particular discovery is that it is an influenza type A, so from that avian influenza lineage, and that it's been found in milk. And we all know how important milk is to our food systems and to human nutrition. And so if you're just taking that milk from infected cows, they've found quite high levels of influenza virus. I hasten to add that in tests that have been done in pasteurized milk, while they've determined fragments of virus, they have not found any evidence of viable virus. So the pasteurization process is working, and that's the usual process from these large commercial herds. Milk is pasteurized to ensure safety, and that's done from past infectious diseases that we've had to deal with to make sure that the milk is safe when it gets on to the store shelves. However, unpasteurized milk can contain high levels of virus, higher than many would have expected. They're finding that really you're getting quite impressive viral replication in the udder of cows. And so we've got a virus that we know has now turned up in these dairy herds. But concerningly, this comes off the back of finding the virus in new species of mammals and quite tragically, outbreaks in both wild bird and mammals in the Antarctic. So it's now managed to hit all of the continents, and I cross my fingers, except Australia. This lineage has not yet reached Australia. That may simply be our good luck with the migratory bird flyways that pass over Australia. It might also be a consequence of our biosecurity standards. But it is this concern that it has evolved to a point where it is able to infect cows. And the difficulty is that it's not killing the cows. The cows just look a little bit off colour. And what happens in these herds when cows look off colour, as soon as they show symptoms, they're taken out. Their milk is not going into the milk that's sold. However, you will have some virus being replicated and shed before the cows look ill. So a cow that's a little off colour, humans that have some mild conjunctivitis. These are, in many cases, non-specific symptoms. So this is the difficulty of doing the monitoring and picking up these new expressions of this disease that haven't been seen before and that could be caused by a range of different pathogens. So it's about labs now being aware that they need to test for a wider range.
So if one of the key potential vectors of spread to human is through milk, and if pasteurization kills most of the virus and really prevents its spread, I mean, that seems like a pretty easy solution. Don't drink raw milk. However, it seems perhaps a harder solution is the potential spread between infected cattle and dairy workers who, by their nature, need to be in and amongst cattle. And it seems from what I've been reading that this is one of the key concerns right now, that the virus may infect not people who drink the milk, but rather workers.
Indeed. And that's the case with avian influenza. Most of the cases, and in the case of avian influenza spreading from chickens to people, we do have a very high case fatality rate based on reported cases. So it is that you've got to be in close contact to come in contact with the viable virus, the live virus. The challenge being that it's not only via milk, and clearly in milking sheds and those working with dairy cattle, it's a moist environment, quite favourable for the virus to remain viable. They are very good at doing good hygiene, but every now and then it's not just controlling the movement of cattle, it can be the movement of people between cattle herds. And we also, in some states in the US and in many countries, often your intensive industries that rely on crops such as maize, soya, often those industries are actually also located close to your farmlands, so you have concentrations of these activities, and that facilitates the spread of the virus because it's sticky, can stick on your hand, on your shoes, and if you don't take great care, you can also move that around, and the virus will also just be looking for that person who is susceptible. So much more genetic diversity in people, but some people will be more susceptible than others. And the other challenge is also, as we clean, as we wash, it may be that that virus will be washed out into the environment. So we have to worry about reverse spillover, so that virus going from cattle sheds back into the environment and being picked up by wild birds and wild animals.
So the worst case scenario here, which I'm not suggesting is a probable scenario, but one I think that keeps a lot of health officials up at night, is that this H5N1 is very deadly when it infects humans. And the idea here is that if it mutates in some way that makes it really easily transmissible like a flu, but also very deadly, then we have a real tragic scenario.
Well, that does keep me up at night. However, my concern and the concern of the Commission on the Prevention of Viral Spillover really is that this threat is not new. The need to be doing something is not now. It was 15, 20 years ago. So it's not only about the worry, for me, the worry about a pandemic and so soon to COVID-19. Nobody wants to go back to having to deal with that. We're now learning to live with COVID-19 because also we have not managed to eradicate the virus. But what is driving it? Why are we seeing this? And these viruses of pandemic potential, the COVID-19, be it avian influenza H5N1, they're part of our environment, and we need to look at the systems that are allowing these viruses to emerge and then to spread so readily. And I understand the people that make decisions, the people that have to allocate scarce resources at the government level are making difficult choices, and they want to focus on just dealing with what comes up now and what vaccine do we need to keep our population safe. But this expansion of H5N1 into dairy herds reminds us very closely of the link with our food systems. So the commercial poultry industry is heralded as a great success of the late 20th and early 21st century. The commercial poultry industry feeds a lot of people, but it has these unforeseen side effects, and the same with these dairy herds, these very high density units that have animals that are very genetically similar just makes the life of the virus so susceptible. And I should say that your USDA right now is also looking at minced meat to make sure that animals that may have been culled, that there's no chance that the virus is also showing up in the muscle that may go into the human food chain. So my concern is that we need to step back. We need the different sectors within government, human health, animal health, plant health, environmental health. We have to work together, and we have to look for options at trying to reduce risk of pathogen emergence and spread, but also do it in a way that's going to make our food systems more resilient, safer, and more efficient.
Your answer here suggests that the root of the problem is our approach to food systems, and that there are reforms and changes at the structural level, perhaps, that ought to be implemented in order to prevent festering of viruses like this. But in the near term, what would you recommend policymakers do to prevent the potential further spread of H5N1 among dairy herds and also between dairy herds and humans?
In terms of spread between dairy herds, your USDA has already made very strong recommendations about stopping the movement of dairy cattle. That's an important first step. So once you can confirm that you have halted movement, then you have to work with all the other moving parts. That's moving parts of people, that we're practicing good hygiene, and also that we are tracking and looking at those other moving parts. So as we know from the examination of past avian influenza outbreaks in Europe, in some cases, the virus moved on egg trays. So there was a big industry in recycling egg trays, so that's great. We're reducing consumption there, but if we're going to recycle those egg trays, they have to be properly disinfected. So what are the parts of the dairy industry where we also need to pay particular attention to make sure that that virus is not hitching a ride? Now, in the US, because of long-term experience with controlling avian influenza over the past 1 to 2 decades, there's already been a lot of studies looking at how would you be able to, for instance, safely move eggs that may have been produced in an area that had avian influenza diagnosed. Are there options for ensuring that you could, for instance, move eggs and do that safely? And so I think in the US conditions, you can rest assured that the authorities are doing their best to do their risk analysis, their risk management to try and really limit this spread. However, the problem is not just a US problem. This particular lineage has come into the US. Its spread has been watched across the world with increasing alarm. And there are parts of the world that do not have the resources that the US has to be able to limit its spread. There are parts of the world where there have been insufficient attention, insufficient investment in animal health, where avian influenza continues to smolder on. And it's these smoldering where avian influenza has become endemic. These are very risky because we know we're dealing with this new lineage. What's the next lineage that's coming? We don't know yet.
On a scale of 1 to 10, as someone who studies these things, how kind of concerned are you that this situation may mutate into human transmission? on a scale, say, of like the 1917 pandemic being 10 and say COVID being 5, where are you? Just big picture.
At this point in time, I'm probably getting up to at least an 8 and a 9. And I say that simply because we know that we have a problem with this new sublineage that's turned up in dairy cattle, but we have a lot of virus that's circulating sometimes in situations where monitoring is less resourced. And so we don't know exactly what the situation is. So I'm concerned that it is highly likely on the probability. The more virus you have, that increases the probability of that one replication that's going to generate that virus that is going to spread easily between people. But I also say this is an opportunity because it's not just about stopping that next virus, that next emergence. This is our chance to look and to emphasize good health for everybody. It's not just about stopping pandemic in people. It's about providing the resources and the approach that's going to lead to good health in animals and good health in our environment. And that's what we need for the long-term survival of our species, because without a healthy environment, without healthy animals, and without healthy plants, we cannot maintain our health. So it's a concern. It's also a fabulous opportunity to really work and to make sure that the systems that are sustaining us are as healthy as they can be.
So, I mean, one of my kind of big takeaways from this conversation thus far is just the structure of how we have organized our poultry and dairy system seems to have been ideal for the emergence of this H5N1 avian flu and its continuing evolution. So, assuming and hoping that this current outbreak could be contained, farther down the road, what are some key structural reforms to the system that could be implemented that might reduce the risk of yet another H5N1 outbreak that has the potential to spill over to humans?
In addition to talking about cattle and chickens, I'd also add pigs to the list. It wasn't that long ago that we were dealing with swine flu, the H1N1. So it is thinking about how we raise animals in these intensive units. So we have to step back and we have to have a focus, firstly, on trying to ensure that these facilities are situated in areas where there's going to be limited contact with wildlife, wild birds, wild animals. So situating them certainly in areas away from wetlands, for instance. We have to think about having limits on the actual numbers of animals that are kept in one unit and what should be the minimum distance between these units, so that if there is an outbreak of an infectious disease in one unit, what's that distance that's going to give us the best chance of controlling and hopefully eradicating that pathogen before it spreads to other units. I also personally believe that we should be looking at genetics. We had, in the post-war era, the 1950s, 60s, where people didn't want to go back to war. They wanted to see everyone having freedom from hunger. And the push there was on production. So selecting for animals that were high yielding. But we can't have everything. So as we selected for high yielding animals, what it meant was that there was less emphasis on the strength of their immune system. So if we look at very high producing animals, what you see is that their immune response has suffered as a consequence. So in the case of the poultry industry, there's been work done to try and ensure that the immune response of these animals is improved, but there's still more work to be done because we don't know what the next pathogen is. And the more diversity we have in terms of genetics, the better the chance are that there will be animals that will be less susceptible and that will reduce the amplification of that pathogen. We have to think about how these animals are fed, what's the nature of their ration that's going to make them as healthy as possible, and also what's the nutrient profile. So once again, as we've selected for high productivity, we now have, for instance, meat birds that are bigger than ever, totally unrecognizable from the meat bird of the 1970s. But their nutrient profile is actually of the key nutrients. protein is good, but in terms of micronutrients, the profile in the meat has reduced. You've got a lower concentration of those vitamins and minerals that are so important. If you look at, in terms of high-producing dairy cattle, their profile of their milk, the nutrient profile per litre or per gallon, has actually been diluted compared to some of the older breeds. If you look at your Jerseys, your Guernsey, and certainly your, indigenous breeds of animals, their nutrient profile in their milk is much denser than our high-yielding dairy cattle. So as we think about having our food systems for the 21st century, we have to think about safety, but we have to think about efficiency. And maybe a cow that's going to yield 10 litres, but 10 litres of really good milk is going to be better than a cow that's giving you 20 with more milk that has more dilute nutrient profile. But we have to have a system that allows farmers to be rewarded for that. So our problem is the way we divide up our sectors. Agriculture and food that's produced within agriculture is considered a commodity, and those price signals are not encouraging farmers or are not enabling farmers to be able to look at quality across the board as much as quantity. So it's a big discussion. Everybody has to be involved. As we talk about developing sustainable and circular bioeconomies, I think linking the need to limit the emergence and spread of pathogens with the need to make sure that the way we produce food is going to give us the most concentrated form of nutrients and reducing the wider footprint of the food system on our environment. These are crucial discussions, and it's going to be economists coming up with fair and sustainable ways of remunerating the people who produce our food in a way that allows them to produce it safely.
That was a really interesting answer. Thank you. I had not thought about any of those issues prior, and I suspect many of my listeners have not as well. I'm glad I was able to ask you about that. Well, Robyn, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thanks for listening to Global Dispatches. The show is produced by me, Mark Leon Goldberg. It is edited and mixed by Levi Sharp. If you are listening on Apple Podcasts, make sure to follow the show and enable automatic downloads to get new episodes as soon as they're released. On Spotify, tap the bell icon to get a notification when we publish new episodes. And of course, please visit globaldispatches.org to get on our free mailing list, get in touch with me, and access our full archive. Thank you.